The corridors of 15th-century Europe's palaces concealed secrets darker than any dungeon, none more haunting than the story of Princess Eleonora, whose very existence would be erased from official records to protect a crown built on deception. What follows isn't just a tale of royal scandal, it's a chilling reminder of how power corrupts absolutely, how silence becomes a deadlier weapon than any blade, and how a young girl's life was sacrificed at the altar of reputation. This was the story meant to vanish forever, buried beneath centuries of polished lies and diplomatic smokescreens. Yet truth, like water, always forces its way through the smallest cracks in the walls of deception. In the autumn of 1456, whispers echoed through the royal court of a mid-sized European kingdom, its name carefully hidden in historical accounts. Princess Eleonora, barely 15, began showing unmistakable signs that threatened to collapse an entire dynasty. The court physicians were summoned in secrecy, sworn to silence under penalty of death. Their examinations confirmed the queen's worst fear. The princess, unmarried and unbetrothed, was with child. In those times, such a revelation could spark wars, shatter alliances, and unravel centuries of carefully guarded bloodlines. The timing could not have been worse. The kingdom was negotiating crucial marriage contracts with neighboring powers, agreements dependent entirely on Eleonora's virtue and availability as a bargaining piece in Europe's ruthless political chess game. In the medieval world, a woman's worth was measured solely by her ability to produce heirs and forge alliances. Female autonomy held no weight. Daughters were property, transferred from father to husband, their bodies mere vessels to continue ancient bloodlines. Church and state together enforced strict moral codes applied most harshly to those least able to resist. A princess's virginity was not her own. It was state property, a diplomatic asset as valuable as any treasury or army. The irony was cruel. While women bore the crushing burden of purity, men who violated these codes often escaped without consequence, especially when cloaked in power. The kingdom itself was in turmoil. Surrounded by ambitious rivals and fractured by religious unrest, the royal family's legitimacy hung by a thread. The king, Eleonora's father, had only recently consolidated power after a bloody succession crisis that left nobles divided and suspicious. One scandal, especially one tainting the royal bloodline, could reignite old wars and embolden his enemies. The court was a nest of vipers where every smile hid a dagger, and every courtesy concealed ambition. In this world, reputation was everything. A single crack in the facade could bring down an empire built over generations. The revelation of Eleonora's condition sent tremors through the royal household. Though carefully contained within palace walls, the king's fury was volcanic, not directed at finding justice for his daughter, but at shielding the dynasty. Emergency councils were convened in the dead of night, attended only by advisors whose loyalty was proven through secrets that could topple kingdoms. The question was never who had committed the crime, but how to keep it hidden. Desperate solutions were debated. A hasty marriage to a minor noble willing to be bribed, an invented illness requiring the princess to vanish into a convent, even the unthinkable suggestion of ending the pregnancy through dangerous medieval methods that might claim both mother and child. It was in these frantic deliberations that an unspoken truth began to surface. The queen's own brother, the Duke of Belvoir, one of the most powerful men in the kingdom, had long been unusually close to his niece. What was once dismissed as affectionate fondness now took on a sinister tone. Pressed under threat of torture, servants recalled troubling details. The Duke's late-night visits to Eleonora's chambers when her ladies-in-waiting had been dismissed, the stream of extravagant gifts from foreign lands, the way the princess had grown withdrawn and nervous in his presence. The fragments formed a mosaic too disturbing to ignore. The Duke of Belvoir was a man celebrated for honor and nobility. A veteran of countless military campaigns, he had won respect with calculated bravery and strategic brilliance. In court, he was admired for his refined tastes, his vast library, his patronage of scholars and artists. He never married, claiming his loyalty to crown and military duty left no room for personal life. This carefully crafted image made him above suspicion, and his bond with the princess was seen as the natural affection of an uncle without children of his own. His exotic perfumes, rare manuscripts, and jeweled trinkets for Eleonora were considered harmless indulgences. but behind the polished mask lay a predator. His grooming had begun when Eleonora was barely 7, too young to recognize the danger. He presented himself as her confidant and teacher, the only adult who understood her intelligence and dreams. While her parents were consumed by affairs of state, he filled the emotional void, teaching her Latin and Greek, introducing philosophy and poetry, painting himself as the enlightened alternative to the suffocating court. These private lessons gradually turned into opportunities for inappropriate closeness. What began as a hand on her shoulder while reading became lingering embraces, kisses that slipped lower, and touches that frightened her, though he assured her they were nothing more than familial love. As Eleonora grew older, the manipulation deepened. The Duke isolated her, undermining her trust in her ladies-in-waiting, insisting they envied her beauty and wit. He convinced her she was too special for the crude young nobles who might have courted her, crafting a world where he alone was her true companion. The gifts became more intimate. Silk garments from the East, perfumes he applied to her wrists himself, poetry books with passages carefully marked about forbidden love. Whenever she showed discomfort, he alternated between reassurance and guilt, warning her that rejection would break his heart. Her dependence on him grew, her fear of losing his affection binding her tighter. When the abuse finally crossed into the physical, it was disguised in the language of privilege and education. The Duke convinced Eleonora that what passed between them was a sacred secret, something that elevated her above other girls her age. He twisted scripture and philosophy to justify his actions, weaving elaborate arguments that dressed abuse in the disguise of enlightenment. One moment he treated Eleonora as a woman far older than her years. The next he reminded her of her childish ignorance, keeping her perpetually off balance and dependent on his version of reality. Their encounters were calculated with precision, taking place during religious observances when the palace stood nearly deserted, or while hunting parties kept others occupied. He exploited his knowledge of the palace's hidden passages, information gained during military campaigns, to slip in and out of her chambers unseen. The manipulation cut deeper than the physical abuse. The Duke made Eleonora complicit in her own suffering, convincing her that she had invited his attention, that the guilt was as much hers as his. He preyed on her natural adolescent confusion, twisting the emotions of youth into evidence of her supposed fault. Whenever she resisted or expressed doubt, he turned cold, withholding the emotional support she craved until she begged for forgiveness. This cycle of violation and reconciliation forged a trauma bond that trapped her, leaving her unable to seek help, even if she had believed anyone would dare take her word over that of the revered Duke of Belvoir. When Eleonora discovered she was pregnant, her first emotion was not terror but desperate hope, that this undeniable proof would finally force the adults to acknowledge the truth. In her confused way, she had tried to signal distress to her mother, but the Queen dismissed her pleas as nothing more than teenage moods. Now, with evidence no one could ignore, Eleonora believed justice would come, that her uncle would be punished, and that she would finally be protected. You won't believe how quickly that hope was crushed. When Eleonora confessed the truth to her mother, naming the Duke as the father, she watched the Queen's face flicker from shock to rage, then settle into chilling resignation. This moment would haunt history. A mother torn between her duty as a parent and her loyalty to the crown. And she chose the crown. She knew that exposing her brother would ignite scandal capable of destroying the dynasty itself. The Duke commanded armies, held noble allies, and possessed enough secrets to fracture the kingdom if accused. Acknowledging his crime would hand their enemies the perfect weapon. So the Queen made her calculation. Her daughter's suffering was a price worth paying for the stability of the realm. From that moment, she became her brother's accomplice, helping weave the fiction that would bury the truth alongside her daughter's future. When the king finally confronted the Duke, it was political theater disguised as justice. Behind closed doors, the men haggled over Eleonora's fate like merchants over grain. The Duke showed no remorse. Instead, he leveraged his power, reminding the king of his support during the succession crisis, of noble families who would rebel if he were disgraced, of foreign intelligence he could conveniently leak. The king, torn between paternal fury and political survival, swallowed his anger and bargained with the man who had violated his child. The agreement was a monument to cold pragmatism, The Duke would accept a prestigious diplomatic post in a distant court, celebrated publicly as a reward for loyal service. Eleonora, meanwhile, would vanish from public life. The official story was carefully staged. The princess had contracted a mysterious wasting disease requiring strict isolation. The realm's best physicians were said to be treating her, though in truth none came near her rooms. Public prayer services were arranged, and the royal family played their grief for the crowds. The cover was so convincing that even courtiers who suspected darker truths kept silent, unwilling to risk their positions with dangerous questions. Eleonora was moved to a forgotten wing of the palace, long abandoned, where she would endure her pregnancy in total seclusion. Only a handful of servants attended her, chosen for loyalty and threatened into silence. Her months of confinement were pure psychological torture. Her windows were bricked over, trapping her in eternal twilight. Servants were forbidden to speak beyond necessities. She was denied books, paper, or entertainment, officially to prevent her from writing about her ordeal, but in reality to strip her of hope. Once adorned in silks and jewels, she now wore coarse wool fit for peasants. The gardens where she once sought comfort were off limits. She was denied even the simple act of looking outside. Every trace of her identity as Princess Eleonora was erased until she existed only as a problem to be managed. The isolation shattered her. At first, she clung to memory, inventing imaginary companions and reliving happier days before her uncle had poisoned her life. She marked time with meal deliveries and the changing of candles. Servants whispered that they heard her singing lullabies at night to the unborn child, the only expression of love allowed her. But as the months passed, lucidity slipped away, replaced by rage-filled outbursts where she screamed her uncle's crimes into the empty walls. When her labor came, it was long and brutal, her body weakened by youth and deprivation. No doctors, only a midwife brought from far away, chosen for her anonymity and the ease with which she could vanish. Eleonora's screams echoed through the abandoned wing, but no comfort came. The Duke, now comfortably stationed abroad, received coded reports but showed no interest in the child, save one demand that the baby be taken from its mother immediately. At last, Eleonora delivered a healthy boy. She was granted only a fleeting glimpse before he was ripped from her arms. She begged, pleaded, even threatened, but her words met stony silence. Wrapped in rough cloth, the infant was smuggled out under cover of night, sent, it was said, to be raised in a monastery far from the capital. No records were ever kept of which monastery received the child, if indeed a monastery was his true destination. Some historians argue he was killed immediately to prevent any future challenge to the throne, while others suggest he grew up unaware of his heritage, hidden among the countless nameless monks of Europe. Eleonora would never know her son's fate, a final cruelty that haunted her until her shortened life came to an end. The aftermath of the birth brought a new stage of her imprisonment. With the pregnancy problem resolved, the king's advisors debated her future. Some urged that she be sent to a convent, allowed to take vows and live out her life in restricted seclusion. Others feared that even in a convent, she might still find ways to send her story beyond the palace walls. The king, driven either by his wife's cold pragmatism or by his own shame at failing to protect his daughter, chose the harshest path. Eleonora would remain in her palace prison indefinitely, transformed into a living ghost, erased from history piece by piece. The court declared the princess had died of illness. A lavish funeral was staged with an empty coffin, complete with official mourning. The erasure of Eleonora's existence was methodical. Her portraits vanished from galleries, one painter even imprisoned until he agreed to paint her out of a family portrait. Records were altered, genealogies rewritten overnight by weary scribes. Her childhood toys and books, anything with her name, were burned. Her ladies-in-waiting were scattered, forced into convents or marriages with obscure nobles forbidden to ever speak of her. Within a year, Princess Eleonora had been officially erased, living on only in the silenced memories of those who once knew her. Meanwhile, locked away in her hidden chambers, Eleonora spiraled deeper into despair. With no purpose left, she turned to documenting her suffering. Using a needle from her clothing, she carved words into stone, leaving her hands scarred and bloody. She scratched out calendars to count the days since her child was taken, though isolation left her uncertain if her tally was true. She hid fragments beneath floorboards and within seams of clothing, desperate to leave behind proof she had existed. Her secret writings became both haunting and ingenious. She used charcoal, and at times even her own blood, to write on scraps of fabric torn from bedding. She invented a rough cipher, more the product of a deteriorating mind than a true code. Historians who later studied these fragments found not only her accounts of abuse, but also poetry of heartbreaking beauty, reflections on justice and power, and desperate letters to the son she would never see. One chilling entry, dated about 3 years after his birth, reads, "Today I forgot the color of his eyes. I am losing him again, piece by piece, memory by memory. Soon I will have nothing left of him but the pain of his absence." The servants who tended Eleonora developed complex emotions toward her. Fear kept them silent, but many were disturbed by what they witnessed. Decades later, an elderly maid confessed, her words dismissed as delirium, that the princess clung to dignity in small, defiant ways. She prayed morning and evening, asked that her meager meals be served with ceremony, and tried to teach herself languages from the few books she was given. These small acts unsettled the staff, a daily reminder that they were complicit in slowly murdering an innocent woman. Far from this tragedy, the Duke of Belvoir thrived abroad. His diplomatic post at a wealthy Eastern court was hailed as vital for trade and alliances, and he performed his duties flawlessly. He secured treaties, held dazzling banquets, and sent back reports praised for their insight. He even married into a noble family, polishing his image of respectability. When word of Eleonora's death reached him, he sent a carefully crafted letter full of grief and praise, preserved in the royal archives as proof of his loyalty. Back home, the truth lingered as an open secret. New servants whispered about the sealed wing of the palace, only to be silenced with threats. Parents used her fate as a warning to their daughters. Disobedience could mean an end like the princess's. The queen herself was sometimes seen gazing at the locked wing with deep sorrow, though she never spoke of what it concealed. The king, increasingly paranoid and tyrannical, imposed stricter moral laws, perhaps an attempt to bury his guilt beneath false virtue. For Eleonora, the years dragged on. By her 20th year, she lived in delusion, convinced her son would one day return to save her. Each morning she prepared for his arrival, arranging her few belongings as if ready to leave, and each night she collapsed when he never came. Her paranoia grew. She saw her attendants as spies of her uncle. Violent outbursts forced guards to restrain her for days. She refused food, believing it poisoned, and had to be force-fed to survive. Her faith, once her anchor, became another torment. Raised in strict Catholic devotion, she began to believe her suffering was punishment for sins she did not understand, or that her uncle's crimes had somehow tainted her. A priest who visited offered no solace, insisting her pain was God's will. Left without comfort, Eleonora developed her own theology, seeing herself as a Christ-like figure suffering for the sins of powerful men. Her secret writings reveal these thoughts, blasphemous to the church but vital to her survival. By the age of 25, she appeared decades older. Her hair had turned gray, her body frail, her cough constant from the damp. Poor light had ruined her eyes, yet flashes of her sharp mind endured. In lucid moments, she railed against her captors with fiery eloquence, quoting classics she had studied and twisting them into searing indictments of her uncle and all complicit. Such speeches were deemed dangerous, and she was isolated further to silence her words. In her final years, an eerie calm settled over her. She no longer tried to escape, no longer raged. She arranged her few belongings into precise patterns, hummed strange melodies, and spoke to unseen companions. Some believed she had found peace through madness, others suspected she was plotting. But the truth was likely simpler. After 13 years of captivity, she had drained herself of both hope and fury. What remained was only existence. The exact circumstances of Eleonora's death at 28 remained cloaked in mystery. The official record claimed she died quietly in her sleep, found lifeless in her bed one morning. But the servant who discovered her body later insisted there were signs of a struggle, though whether against another person or death itself, no one could say. Some believe she was silenced deliberately, perhaps because the Duke planned to return to court and wanted no risk of her truth emerging. Others argue she finally chose her own escape, ending her life by whatever desperate means she could find. The truth, like so much of Eleonora's story, was buried with her in an unmarked grave at the edge of the palace grounds, denied consecration, denied dignity, Her death set off a frenzy of activity to erase all traces of her. The rooms where she had wasted away were scrubbed and refurbished, her carvings covered hastily with plaster. Yet the workers missed much. The floorboards where she had hidden scraps went untouched, the messages sewn into tapestries overlooked, some of her markings merely concealed, not destroyed. Her body was dumped at night with no ceremony, no marker, no record. The servants who had cared for her were scattered with bribes and threats, though years later a few would confess pieces of the truth on their deathbeds. 5 years after her death, the Duke of Belvoir returned to court, his diplomatic mission celebrated as a triumph. He was welcomed with honors, his sins forgotten or forgiven. He thrived for 2 more decades, amassing riches and titles, posing as a patron of learning and the arts. When he died at 73, he was granted a state funeral and entombed in the royal cathedral under a monument praising his loyalty and wisdom. Not a single word hinted at the monstrous legacy he left behind. The queen survived her daughter by only 3 years, haunted in her final months by nightmares. Servants whispered that she would wake screaming Eleonora's name, begging unseen figures for forgiveness. On her deathbed, she tried to confess to a priest, but the king ordered everyone out. Her last words, overheard by a young nurse, were chilling. "The stones will tell the truth." Brushed aside as delirium, the remark now seems to have been a desperate attempt to point toward her daughter's carvings. The king lingered another decade, sinking into paranoia and cruelty. Obsessed with rooting out disloyalty, he executed nobles on flimsy suspicions and imposed suffocating moral laws that seemed more about easing his guilt than serving justice. He poured fortunes into religious monuments as if buying absolution. By the time of his death, his people did not mourn him. It was his distant cousin who inherited the weakened kingdom, and in seeking to uncover why the monarchy had faltered, ordered a full inventory of the palace. That inventory would spark the first rediscoveries of Eleonora's hidden record. Nearly 50 years after her death, during renovations meant to modernize the palace, workers stumbled into sealed rooms long forgotten. What they found caused a sensation among those privy to the secret. Walls covered with desperate carvings, messages beneath loose boards, scraps of fabric written in what appeared to be blood. Panic swept the court. Some urged immediate destruction to protect the crown's image. Others argued the evidence must be preserved. In the end, the relics were locked away in a private archive, shown only to the monarch and a select few advisors. But secrets leak. Over centuries, fragments surfaced. Deathbed confessions recorded by priests, stray remarks in the Duke's diplomatic letters, and most importantly, a partial copy of Eleonora's writings preserved by a sympathetic archivist who believed truth deserved survival. Hidden in a monastery library, that copy lay undisturbed for 100 years before it was found. The full picture only came to light in the early 20th century, when democratization allowed historians unprecedented access to the royal archives. Among the documents they uncovered was a guard's secret account, hidden in a book's binding describing her torment in detail. Combined with the sealed room evidence and scattered testimony, the horrifying truth of Eleonora's life was finally laid bare. The revelations erupted into scandal, forcing the kingdom to reckon with its past and the system that enabled such crimes. Modern forensics have confirmed much. The fabric writings date to the correct era, and linguistic study shows they came from a highly educated woman whose grasp on formal language unraveled over time. The carvings match tools improvised by someone in captivity. Blood traces tested for DNA could prove lineage, but the current royal family has refused to provide samples, dismissing the request as disrespectful to their ancestors. Even before the revelations were public, Eleonora's ghostly presence shaped the monarchy. The rumor of a princess erased for shame instilled fear. Royal daughters lived under constant watch, their freedoms curtailed, some sent to convents at the slightest sign of independent thought. Her fate became a warning, one that justified generations of oppressive control over women. The Duke's descendants, prominent in politics and society, have responded in different ways. Some financed efforts to dispute the evidence, desperate to clear their name. Others accepted the truth, supporting causes for survivors of abuse. One descendant, a noted feminist scholar, has written extensively about how his unchecked power was not an anomaly, but a symptom of patriarchal systems that protected him. To see him as uniquely evil, she argues, is to ignore the structures that allowed him to act with impunity. The mystery of Eleonora's son lingers. The monastery where he was supposedly sent has never been identified. Candidates with noble bearing but obscure origins have been proposed, including one scholar-theologian who wrote deeply about justice and mercy, writings some see as echoes of hidden knowledge. Yet nothing can be proven. Perhaps the child died at birth. Perhaps he lived unaware of his lineage. Legal scholars now study Eleonora's case as a chilling lesson in how power corrupts justice. Every institution, family, church, and crown, failed to protect her, instead closing ranks to preserve authority. Her tragedy has been cited in debates over diplomatic immunity, mandatory abuse reporting, and the need for independent courts not beholden to political power. Her surviving writings, authenticated and preserved, have become a resource for modern psychology. They mirror what today's survivors describe: the confusion over consent, the corrosive guilt, the slow collapse under isolation. Therapists now use her words to better understand trauma. Her mental decline, documented in real time, is a rare and harrowing record of prolonged abuse. The Queen's role continues to divide scholars. Was she too a victim of a patriarchal system, forced to sacrifice her daughter for survival? Or did she knowingly choose cruelty to maintain power? Likely it was both. Her torment in later years suggests she realized too late the magnitude of her betrayal. And yet Eleonora's legacy is not one of silence. Despite every effort to erase her, she endures. Despite attempts to destroy her voice, she still speaks. Her words, carved in stone, written in blood, outlasted the dynasty that tried to bury them. Her story, meant to vanish, has become immortal. Princess Eleonora was 15 when her childhood ended, 28 when her life ended. But her truth lives on. Each person who learns her story, who refuses to forget, becomes part of her revenge. She was never just a victim. She became the witness, the accuser, the voice that cannot be erased.